All right, so we're going to be creating our clay eye today, and we're going to think about the drawing that we did and how we made the scales and how we made the eyes, what details we drew in, and we're going to think, how do we want to make those in clay? Are we going to want to make those shapes and add them to our tile? Are we going to want to carve them with special tools or use the stamps? Are we going to want to make additional clay pieces or indentations with our fingers and our tools? So you have to think about all the different parts of your design and decide which pieces you're going to add and how you're going to add them. And remember, just like when we're drawing, we want a close-up of our eyes. We want it nice and big. We don't want any tiny little eyes. And we want it to go all the way. Look, when my eye goes closer, I fill the whole picture. And there's not any space around me anymore. It's just my big eye taking up the whole space. And we're going to do the same thing with our dragon eyes. All right, let's look at what you have at your table now. So the first thing is that you have some newspaper to lay down. And no matter whether or not you use all of this or not, at the end of class, it all goes in the trash can, okay? The newspaper does not get saved. It just goes straight into the trash. You're going to work on newspaper to keep your table clean. The next thing you have at your table is plates. These plates are to put your slab of clay on, your tile, so that as you're building it, you can just bring this to me at the end of class for me to store for you, okay? Also, if you keep it on this plate, you don't have to worry about your clay getting stuck to the table as you're working. So those are the first two things you have. Along with your newspaper and your plate, you're going to have your sponge. Remember, we have our clay water in here that we call slip, and this is our glue, and it also helps us smooth things out. You have a box full of tools. We have some ribs that we can use for smoothing clay. And we have some different tools that we can use for carving and scooping and drawing, okay? We have plastic knives that we can use for cutting, scooping, drawing, carving. These ribs are actually little paint scrapers, but they have these little textures that we can also use in clay that are really fun. So they're going to be a variety of different sized indents on these that will create different textures. And then you have some other tools too. These are different kinds of texture stamps. So you have some of these that are made out of clay, and everybody's at every table is going to be a little bit different. You have some of these spools that have different buttons glued to them that you can use for stamping. And then you're going to have some random found objects that you can use to make different textures. Okay? So all of these things are tools that I might decide to use while I'm making my dragon eye. Along with all of that, the very last thing you have is a rolling pin to share at your table. The rolling pin is going to help you flatten out any extra pieces of clay you might want. So if you have some extra clay, but it's not the size you want, you can ball it all up and then roll it out again to be a flat piece. All right, so those are all my tools. So now I'm ready to get started. All right, you have a clay tile like this. The first thing we're gonna do is smooth out the side that's up. So whichever side is given to you, that's the side you're gonna smooth out. And you can see I'm on top of my paper plate. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my sponge and I'm just going to wet my fingers like this, and I'm going to lightly smooth my clay out. The second option is to squeeze all the water out of the sponge into the cup. See, I'm not squeezing this on my clay. It's going in the cup. I don't want all this water on my clay. It will get way too soft. That's why I squeezed it all out. So now you can see if I squeeze my sponge, no water is coming out, maybe a tiny, tiny bit, but it's mostly clay at this point, and it's not going to make my clay too wet. I'm going to use this or my two fingers, either one works, to get some of this smoothed out, okay? And then if it's really hard to smooth, that's what you can use the rib for, okay? And you can use that to smooth out your clay and your edges too. But we just want to get rid of the texture left from the canvas mats when we were rolling these for you. Okay, the last thing that you have your table that I forgot to tell you about is pasta letters. And the pasta letters are to create your name in your clay. All right, So you have some pasta letters and a little lid like this, and you're going to search for your name. So I'm going to look for my name in here real quick, and I'm going to actually push these letters into my pasta. And what I like to do is I like to put them in whatever order I find them, and I just leave a gap because sometimes I inevitably find a letter as soon as I don't need it. So I'm actually working backwards here. I got my Z and my A for Diaz, and then I found a D. So I'm going to put the D in, and I'm just leaving a space for the I real quick. Now you can put your first name, your last name, or both. Now, if another class was doing the same project, we would also put our class code here, but your class is the only class doing this, so we don't have to worry about class code this time. All right, and I can even smooth over that, and I'm actually going to leave these letters in. I'm not even going to take them out, okay? They can go in the kiln, and when it comes out, all that's going to be left is your name. So now that I've done this side, I'm going to carefully flip this over. If you're having a hard time getting it up because you got it too wet, you can put your hand under the plate and push, and it should pop right up. Now, like, this side is rough. So I'm going to do the same thing I did on the other side. I'm going to smooth it out. I can use my fingers, my sponge that I've squeezed all the water out ahead of time, or my rib. But the goal is, again, if I have any little holes that I see or any of the texture left over from the canvas mat, I'm just getting rid of that. I want a nice smooth tile to start my design. Now, you have just a small amount of clay to start with. If you use this all up, you can raise your hand to get more. But what I'm going to start with is the same thing I started with when I was drawing. Do you guys remember what that was? Your eye. So we're going to take the clay, and I'm going to think about how big I want my eyeball. Probably don't want my eyeball that big. So I'm going to go about half. And I am just taking this and rolling it around in my hands. Okay. Now, if I see that my clay is getting dry, I can use some of the water from my cup. And see, I'm just getting a tiny bit here, and I'm rubbing it to make my hands moist so my hands don't dry out my clay. Okay. So I'm going to roll a ball and see if that's about the size I want it. And I might decide I want it bigger or smaller. I want mine a little smaller, and I'm going to show you why. Because what I'm actually going to do is flatten this out, and it's going to make it get wider. So right now it looks a little too small. It's probably perfect. I'm going to take my clay, and on my newspaper, because I don't want to get it on my table and get stuck. See how I just kind of hit that out? Now watch what happens. I put that on there, and it is taking up more space. But now it's not a perfect ball. So this is where I get to kind of play around with the clay. So I'm going to start by scoring and slipping to attach these. If you've forgotten what that is, that means I take a tool and I scratch my clay up, and I take a tool and I scratch this side of my clay. And I'm doing this to help the pieces stick together. I'm going to take my slip, which is my clay water, okay, and I'm going to use it like glue. And I don't have to worry about using too much because it'll dry, okay? Now, I'm going to kind of put it where I want it, and now I'm going to kind of finish shaping my eyeball to be the size that I want. I can push it to make it flatter. Okay, just like that. Now, if you remember, your eye had some details in here. So now you're going to have to decide if you want to carve those, add more clay on top, or use stamping tools. I am going to carve mine, and I'm going to use a variety of tools. I'm going to start by making the little reflection in the eye that was really small. You remember that white little circle I told y'all to add? I'm going to press down to create that. And then I'm going to get one of my carving tools, and I'm going to make the iris and pupil. Remember, that's the black part of the eye is the pupil, okay? And the colorful part of your eye is the iris. And it could be any shape. And don't worry if you mess up, because you can rub out. See how I'm rubbing this clay to fix my mistakes? Just rub out my mistakes. So that's kind of nice. All right, so there I have. I think I'll make that just like that. Now I have to decide, do I want more shapes or do I just want these that I have? Okay, and you guys get to decide that. It's your project, and there's some opportunities for you to be creative here. But if you're not sure what you want to do, just think back to your drawing. What did you do for your drawing? Can you just do the same thing? Maybe. Okay, so as you're doing this, if you decide you don't like something you did, again, just a little slip on my fingers, and a lot of that I can just get rid of. Like, I didn't like that extra circle I drew in the middle, so I'm just going to smooth it out. And I can even play around with different tools and figure out which ones work better to do what I want. Okay, maybe the tool I'm using isn't the right tool. I can also turn, just like I turn my paper, I can turn my clay so that I can see it from different sides and different angles to make sure that everything looks okay, because I want it to look good from every point of view. All right. Once you have your eyeball done, it's time to start adding scales. So this is where more of my extra clay comes in. And I have to decide what kind of shapes I want. If I want kind of round shapes, I might make them the same as I made my eyeball and just kind of flatten them out to make scales. If I want them more triangular, I can cut them. And I can either squeeze this clay flat or I can use my rolling pin to roll the clay. I'm not going to do that because it's going to make my camera shake. But you can use the rolling pin to flatten your clay as long as you do it on top of newspaper. Then once this is flat, I can cut out shapes. So if you wanted like triangles or rectangles, you could cut those out of the flat clay to make your scales. Okay? So depending on what kind you want. And then if you have any cracks, remember to smooth those out. You may have to keep getting your fingers or your hands wet if your clay keeps drying out. Okay? And then you're going to start placing these around. If you want to make them stick extra, remember we want to make sure they stick. We're going to score and we're going to slip. Okay? And then you have to decide how you want these lined up and where you're going to start. So I'm actually going to start from this corner and work my way around so that they all overlap on top of the ones that are behind them. Okay? So I'm going to put my first scale here. And now I can also think about, do I want any extra textures on here? I could draw designs into my scales, or I can find those fun texture tools I told you about, and I can use those to stamp extra texture into my scales. So see, I just stamped that, and it's going to look so cool when I glaze it. Okay, so I make a few more scales here, and then it's going to be time to add the eyelid and let you guys get to work for yourselves. All right, as you can see, I'm overlapping, which means I am putting pieces on top of other pieces. That's why I wanted to start at the back and work my way forward so it would look like they were overlapping. So that's something that you can think about as you go. Now I'm choosing to do all of the same texture on all my scales, but you don't have to do that, okay? You also don't have to have the same shaped scale all the way, because some of you did that in your projects where the same scale was on the whole project, and some of you did different types of scales. And so either one of those is all right. That's the best thing about making a fictional or mythical animal like a dragon, is that we don't know exactly what they look like. So we get to make it up. All right, don't worry if you don't finish these today. We are going to be working on these for more than one class period. That's another reason why it's so important to have our name on our clay. Now, if you have something you decide you don't like, you can pull it up. It may not want to come up, especially if you really attached it well. So you might have to use a tool. Just be careful you don't damage the slab underneath too much because you want that to be nice and strong. So see, I just pulled those up like that so I could redo them because I felt like they were too flat. All right, so I've done about half that way. I think I'm going to switch it up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is start making them more round and circular instead of oval. And that's just a slight change just for fun. So I can see how it looks. And I'm also going to switch my stamp, but I want it to still be similar. So we'll see what I have here. And I can decide which one I'm going to do. Oh, I like that. I'm going to do that one for the rest of mine. Okay, just remember each time, score and slip. All right, I have all my scales on. The last thing I'm going to do is add an eyelid to kind of seal off this section right here and create some extra overlapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do just like I was rolling those balls, but I'm going to turn it into a coil. Okay, and see, this is going to dry out pretty fast if my hands are not moist. So make sure you have some water on your hands when you do this. If you're having a hard time, you can do this on the table like that. You could also flatten out your clay and cut a strip. There's lots of different ways you could do the eyelid. But then I'm going to do one on the top. Okay, and if I've made it too long, I can use something to cut it. And then I'm going to make a second one on the bottom. Kind of create that kind of point that we saw in the eyes. Covering up the edges of my eyeball. And I can smush this, move it around. It's going to get it nice and stuck down as I'm designing it. I can smooth these together, or I can leave it separated like that for the crease where the eyelid meets. And then I can also texture this. So I'm going to show you guys texturing by drawing. So this was stamping. And see, I did some of that drawing. So I can either draw a pattern into my eyelid, like so. Or I could add more clay, just like I've been doing. So maybe I want to make some little pieces of clay and add them on top like that. It's up to you how you want to add these textures as long as you have them. And if at any point something gets kind of smushed on the eyeball, you can just take your tools and recreate whatever little details you may feel like are not strong enough. All right, so there's my finished eyeball. Now remember, a lot of these details, for example, the center of my eye, could be carved or added on, just like I did here. The eyelid I had showed you here, I had drawn them initially, but I went ahead and added clay instead, so either of those would have been fine. So just think about the creative ways you can create your scales, your eyeball, your eyelid, okay? So step one, make the round. Actually, step one was to smooth out this side and put our name in it. Step two is to smooth out the other side. Step three, make the eyeball. Step four, make the scales. And last step, make the eyelid around your eyeball. All right, I hope you guys have fun making this project.